Stanford University.
Welcome. I'm Dr. Tia Rich, founder and director of Stanford Medicine's Contemplation by Design program. Welcome to this session titled Actionable Hope in a Time of Planetary Change. Dr. Nicole Ardoin, associate professor in the Graduate School of Education, will be providing us this session. Dr. Ardoin is also a senior fellow in the Woods Institute for the Environment at Stanford, Emmett Family Scholar and Skytes Family Director of the Emmett Interdisciplinary Program in Environment and Resources in the School of Earth, Energy, and Environmental Sciences. Nicole leads innovative research and teaches inspiring classes. We're grateful that she is with us today to share her wisdom and her research. Welcome, Nicole.
Thank you so much, Tia. I am delighted to be here this afternoon. Having listened to so many of the wonderful talks this week, I truly am honored to be featured as a presenter along with so many thoughtful experts who care so deeply about our world and the people in it. So much has already been said and offered for contemplation, and for that, I'm deeply grateful as well. Today, I'll be focusing on some of the sustainability challenges in particular that we're facing and the role of hope in addressing those challenges. I'll start by sharing a bit about what our lab here at Stanford does, the theoretical frames that underlie our work, and also some of the recent projects that we've been using to explore how people can be part of the solution to sustainability challenges at a range of scales. In today's world, the relentless social media and 24-hour news cycles constantly and exhaustively remind us of the relentless problems that we're facing, from a global pandemic, economic uncertainty, racial tensions and inequities, threats to the future of young people, food insecurity, oppressive governments, to name only a few of the many challenges that we're all facing. Today, I am focusing primarily on environmental issues, which have their own set of gloom and doom headlines. And in the environmental field, we have been infamous for really focusing on doom and gloom. We face climate change, extinction crises, devastating and ravaging wildfires, especially here in California and across the West, freshwater scarcity, zoonotic diseases, ecosystem degradation. I could go on and on. I had the pleasure a number of years ago of working at WWF, and certainly we were focused on so many issues there, and it seems like these issues just continue to grow over time. And yet concurrently, we are implored by public voices of all ages from all around the world that the time to take urgent action is now. Young people remind policymakers, community leaders, parents, and educators that it's imperative we all take action on their behalf. But also for young people, they ask us to provide them with the support, the means, and the functioning educational systems that youth need to develop their own agency, their own sense of self, the opportunities for them to make their own way in the world in a manner that is effective and impactful. Certainly, these are not independent issues. The interplay of the factors makes them even more complex to address, as one cannot easily be separated from each one, the other. As these UN Sustainable Development Goals show us, all these issues are intertwined with poverty, education, environment, governance, among others, all relying upon each other for improvement. Developed collaboratively and implemented by all UN member states, the UN Sustainable Development Goals create a blueprint for the future, stretching to 2030 and beyond. This ambitious set of 17 aspirational goals creates a collective vision for working toward global peace and prosperity for all people and for the planet, addressing issues such as water, climate, transportation, urbanization, technology, and more, and reminding us that these issues are not simply boxes that we can tick. Rather, sustainability is and must be the purview of all of us, from multilateral governments to communities, to adults and youth alike. And indeed, it is true that when we get caught up in the complexity of these issues, it can be overwhelming. The cycle of reflecting only on the negative headlines, only on the issues and complexities, makes it feel easy to be discouraged, like nothing will ever change. However, by taking even a slight perspective shift, we can begin to see positive change that's already happening, thanks to the efforts, the dedication, and perseverance of so many over time. One of the most important elements of this work is to push back against what my dear friend and colleague, Dr. Ellen Kelsey, calls the fallacy of the starting line. That because things seem so bad right now that we can think nothing has ever happened. We can start to forget that we're not the starting line of dealing with these environmental crises. We're not alone in this work. I know that earlier this week, you heard from one of my favorite colleagues, Dr. Gretchen Daly, who talked about the incredibly important work that she and her colleagues have done in ecosystem services and other areas of ecological restoration. Thanks to fields like ecological restoration, environmental history, ecology, and so many others, we can place the urgent issues that we face today within a much longer time frame and context, reminding us that social change can indeed happen, often on larger timescales than we see on a daily basis or that we can imagine as individuals. This perspective provides encouragement by offering us examples of significant societal responses and encouraging us to continue the arduous and seemingly never-ending work of creating social change for a sustainable future. I invite all of you for a moment, along with me, to take a short pause to reflect on this perspective that this can bring to us, recognizing that the work that has occurred in sustainability space by so many dedicated individuals and groups, yourselves included, to make change, even in light of challenging conditions, to recognize that the effort and the perseverance that you have put forth has already started to make a difference. So let's take a brief pause for just 20 or 30 seconds and reflect on the perspective that's brought us here today. And we should now be on the slide that says action, shifting the frame. Thank you. This pause and moment of reflection allows us to shift our frame and our outlook. And in doing so, it can help prepare us for further action. Thanks to what is known in psychology as the fresh start effect, we can wake up every day with a renewed sense of purpose and passion for these issues, focusing not only on the problem orientation, but also on what's already happening and how we as individuals and members of communities can contribute to these collective efforts. We know that shifting from a problem orientation frame to a solutions orientation frame can be a necessary, although certainly not always easy nor sufficient step in the right direction. Understandably, shifting primarily from a problem identification to a solutions frame is not simple. Many natural and social scientists fear that in doing so, we might unintentionally feel complacency on the part of policymakers or corporate entities, future generation, or even among ourselves. Or you may fear that we may seem overly naive or optimistic, suggesting that people don't need to change their behaviors, their habits, because it comes across as, oh, well, it was just maybe an overestimation, or that we may be concerned about championing a less than optimal solution that may require us to take it back or change our minds later. But in searching for a different narrative, we find that this can open up space not to be Pollyanna-ish about hope and optimism and pretending that solutions are simple, but rather this allows us to focus on the building blocks that are available to us, the steps that bring us in the right direction in terms of policy, science, technology, and social change. We can create a future for actionable insights, present and the past, looking at successes and failures, and allowing us to move forward in ways that are efficacious. This revised frame shift allows us to envision a more positive future direction. Social science research tells us that it's very hard to make good decisions when we are in the depths of despair. We know from decades of psychology that rumination and catastrophizing rarely lead to productive action-oriented outcomes. So working in this actionable space, our Social Ecology Lab at Stanford is motivated to study processes and outcomes of environmental learning and behavior. We do so in everyday life settings and what we like to call these more extraordinary ones. We're really motivated by thinking about where is it that people in their everyday lives have an opportunity to learn about the environment, to come together with their neighbors and their friends, and to learn to take action within that context. We also recognize that many people are motivated by what we think of as mountaintop moments, times that you may go on a nature-based tour or go to a park or an aquarium or a museum and have that chance to really poke your head out of your everyday experience. So we try to study in both of those places, what is it that motivates people to take action, both by themselves along with their community members. We do so through theoretical and observational studies. And we do this in a range of ways. You'll see some of them listed here on this slide. We often start first by attempting to understand how various processes and underlying theories are working. We do a lot of systematic reviews. We do a lot of attending conferences and talking to colleagues about what they understand from a range of fields, everything from psychology to anthropology to sociology, political science, geography, and beyond. We look at the various contexts and what ingredients and what doses seem to help motivate people to take action on these challenges that we've been discussing today and this week. And as we develop more nuanced and often more complex understandings of these factors, we develop interventional studies, or those that allow us to test out these ideas on the ground in real world settings. We often start with small scale pilots, which I'll talk about some of those today. And we frequently work in collaboration with community organizations and nonprofits who are wonderful partners for our activities. In addition to our more theoretically informed questions, we address questions that our partners may have about sustainability behaviors and practices in the world. So we often go to our partners and ask them, what's keeping you up at night? What's really challenging for you? What does your board want to know? What are your funders interested in? And then we work with them about that from a theoretical perspective, as well as from a grounded perspective. We often hear questions about how their visitors or constituents are connected to place, for example, or how local residents might be accessing and benefiting from time and nature-rich settings. In this work, there is so much complexity, connection, and constant stimulation. As I hope you can imagine from hearing just a glimpse of this, we never run low on questions to ask. We are so grateful for this abundance. There's, of course, so much, as my daughter told me once when she was younger, scurrying around like a cockroach. But despite that busyness, we are deeply grateful for the opportunity that we have to work on good and challenging questions in our day-to-day lives that allow us to get into a state of flow. This aligns with work that psychologist Adam Grant has done recently on how to move beyond that feeling of languishing, that feeling that so many of us have experienced, I think especially for the past year and a half. And the three principles that Adam mentioned as we try to move beyond this feeling is to look for opportunities for mastery, mindfulness, and mattering in your day work. I invite you now to, along with me, take a short pause to reflect on what notions of gratitude this might bring up for you in your own work. Is there something specific about your work that brings about a sense of gratitude for the ability to master a skill or an experience or a bit of knowledge, to do something that matters in the world? Visualize one or more of those aspects of the work that you're doing currently in the world. Let's take a minute to do that. This pause and reflection creates for us a space to consider with intention where we believe our efforts may be important and impactful. It can lend perspective to our work and help us reorient towards solutions and reset from the constant drumbeat of bad news. As Joanna Macy says, active hope is about waking up to the beauty of life on whose behalf we can act and recognizing that we belong in this world. So, why do we focus on hope in our work? I've told you that we focus on environmental learning, on environmental behavior at the individual and collective level. We focus on connection to place. So why would we focus on hope? Well, as noted, we are particularly intrigued by complicated questions that sit at this interdisciplinary nexus. We consider the precipice between action and inaction, especially on enormous and thorny and overwhelming issues like climate change. So one area where we've been doing a great deal of work for the last 5 or so years related to this is what we call this razor's edge between hope and fear, or optimism and pessimism. We've been asking, how much do people need to understand the dire state of the planet to then feel empowered, knowledgeable, and motivated to take action? We postulate that if we are to move forward, to find solutions, and thrive as individuals and as a species, we need to be able to find and access hope, imagine solutions, work together, and stay well and take care of ourselves and each other. So our lab works to understand these processes in a variety of ways. Well, I hope at this moment you're thinking, what does she mean by hope? Because it's true, there are many definitions of hope. There are countless definitions of it, especially in the academic literature, but in the non-academic literature alike. Indeed, it's a word whose usage in the literature has risen exponentially over the last several decades. And then that increase in attention is really interesting, hugely positive phenomenon. All definitions of hope share a common theme. They all are about a positive appraisal of the future. And in the environmental realm and in the work that we do specifically in our group, another element is often added to this definition. Hope is a feeling that even though the odds may be against a desired state, we still harbor a positive appraisal of the future and our ability to reach that desired state. An aspect of hope that's central to our work on environmental learning in particular is that hope has both cognitive and affective components. That is, hope is cognitive or rational, or affective and emotional. We understand this to mean, and we conduct studies to investigate this, that knowledge and awareness, or the cognitive portion, are incredibly important. It's important for people to be aware of opportunities for action and of past environmental successes, as we discussed. Yet feeling compelled to take action is about more than just knowing. It's also about having an emotional positivity related to an inclination that action is worthwhile. A central concept that intertwines with both the cognitive and emotional aspects of hope is efficacy. We talk a lot about efficacy in our work. That is the feeling that one's actions, both individual and collective, will be effective at addressing the issues that we aim to address. A common theme in research on hope is that feelings of individual and collective efficacy is key to facilitating constructive and productive hope. So we're curious about how that works and how we can create those senses of efficacy that are so crucial to hope. I'd like to give you two examples of our work in practice. So as the first example of our work in practice, I'll share some information about one of our lab's recent projects that looks at the relationship between people and redwood forests, one of my favorite ecosystems on this planet. We began this as part of a larger cross-institutional interdisciplinary study of climate change impacts on California's coastal redwoods. This is called the Summon Project, which is named after the Native American word for redwoods. And one aspect of this project was to investigate the relationship between the shifting coastal fog patterns that we've been seeing over decades and climate change in coastal redwoods. The forest ecologist and climate scientists on the team have been investigating specifically what's been happening with the number of foggy days in redwood forests. And in their research, they're finding that the number of foggy days overall is decreasing. And they've been examining the effects of that decrease on the structure and the health of redwood forests. Our team, the Social Ecology team, has been tasked with understanding how people living in and around and visiting the redwood forests connect with these iconic landscapes, and how those connections can or might inspire greater awareness of climate change and pro-environmental behaviors. We often talk about charismatic megafauna, and this is an example of charismatic megaflora. So importantly, more than just capturing people's experiences and their levels of enjoyment in the forest, we really wanted to contemplate how we might leverage these experiences in redwood forest to inspire a deeper connection to nature and potentially inspire individual and collective actions. One of the earlier stages of the project, which has been multi-part and continuing over several years, was to undertake a study that we called fondly the tree mail study. It was based on a postcard writing activity designed and implemented initially by our partners, the interpretive staff at Muir Woods National Monument. If we were in a big room right now, I'd ask those of you in the room to raise your hand and show how many of you have visited there. I'm sure many of you have. I hope you have. It's one of the most visited units in the National Park Service and in Redwoods National Park. So the interpretive rangers had set up this postcard writing kiosk in the park that's pictured here. And they've asked visitors to write postcard messages to the redwood trees. It's positioned such that the visitors write the messages to the trees as they're leaving the park. And over a 3-year time period, beginning in 2016, they've collected close to 1,000 postcards. They kindly share those postcards with their team as a data source to better understand how visitors have been connecting with the redwood forests. Before I share what we found after doing an analysis of those visitor postcards, I'd like to give a moment to you to imagine yourself sitting in a beautiful redwood forest like Muir Woods, and imagine what message you might share with the trees. Take a moment to write down a few words or phrase on a piece of paper or formulate your message in your mind. And then as I share what we found, You might find it interesting to think about how your message compares with those we found in your woods. So take about 30 seconds for that. So thanks to the staff at Muir Woods, we had close to 1,000 postcards. And once we went through the ones that were written in English and those that actually had text on them and not just images, which a number of people had drawn pictures, which were incredible. And then also those where we could decipher the handwriting, that would have been my problem. My family tells me our handwriting's difficult to read. We ended up with 747 postcards that we were able to analyze. We proceeded to code them qualitatively and find some of the common themes in visitors' narratives to trees. I'll share just a few today because this is a much larger study that is also coupled with other mixed method studies we've been conducting. The overwhelming majority, some 85% of the cards, reference different aspects of connection to nature, from the simple, pure enjoyment of nature, recognizing their love of the place, the beauty of the place, the wonder they experienced while in the forest. The cards also provide evidence of different aspects of connection to nature, like empathizing with trees, a sense of oneness with trees, and a sense of responsibility to the trees. For example, one said, "Thank you. Of all the teachers in my life, your lessons resonate and apply at any time in life. On behalf of the human race, I'm sorry that we've lost sight, and I've taken you all for granted. But change is coming. You're worth so much more. We all are. Thank you for teaching love and community and perseverance and growth. We are one." About a third of the postcards reference some dimensions of place. We do a lot of study of place in our lab, so we're really interested to see how people were characterizing place. Some describe seeing the forest as their church or their home, their escape or their safe haven. Others recalled memories and loved ones who had passed. Still others talked about the forest as a place that provides oxygen and shelter, so related to Gretchen's talk earlier. So here's another really beautiful one I'd love to share. Someone wrote, "I've been coming here my entire life. I'm now 16 years old, and these trees, these redwoods, and all the redwoods across the coast have always been there for me. I come here when I'm sad. I leave this place with a peace that I can't describe. So thank you." As you can see from the two that I've just read, among many others, gratitude is a theme woven through the messages. People express gratitude for the sheer beauty and the enjoyment of the place. They also express gratitude and recognition for our dependence on trees and what we gain from them, whether that's oxygen or keeping animals safe and protected. They thank the trees for providing cultural and spiritual resources, for connecting visitors to their loved ones and ancestors, and for providing perspective and reminding us of our place in the world. So why and how is this important and relevant to our message today of actionable hope? Why am I talking about this with all of you? Well, first, by analyzing these messages, we're gaining a data set that is ground up. While informed by theory, we're also building from people's lived experiences. We're able to see evidence of connection, hope, learning, and gratitude grounded directly in the forest experience. And we can better understand the diverse ways that people connect to a natural place and to the redwoods in particular. The analysis helps consider how we, or our partner service partners, might design specific education or interpretive experiences that support and amplify such connections. And importantly for the work that we do, they tie back to the enormity of today's challenges. They help us see how those interventions might transcend iconic landscapes like the redwoods and become more integrated into everyday life. Ultimately, we're interested in understanding how and under what conditions and for whom place connections and feelings might inspire individual as well as collective action related to issues like climate change, which are changing places like Muir Woods and other redwood forests and threatening the species about which these people have been writing. As sustainability issues are so complex, intertwined, like we discussed, it requires more than individual action to address these problems. Action on a collective scale is necessary, but the collective power is derived initially from individuals being moved and having direct experience, which helps them to recognize the need and the joy in coming together. We thus continue to build on this work in the redwoods and numerous other studies, as well as research in a range of other fields. For example, we know from psychology the process of expressing gratitude improves well-being and helps people cope with uncertainty, such as that comes with climate change. We also know that reflecting on our experiences is part of our learning process. It helps meld our emotional or affective experiences with the cognitive and knowledge-related aspects of a visitor experience, ultimately forging a critical basis for building efficacy and taking action. So for these reasons and many more, analyzing the postcard data, along with other key qualitative, quantitative, and mixed method studies that we've conducted as part of the Redwoods project, it's important when thinking about how we move from a visitor's personal individual experience to motivating environmental behaviors at broader scales. Finally, I'll end today with a short description about a much larger study that we have in process. There's so much more to say about this, but it's incredibly relevant to our topic today, so I couldn't end without talking about our project on collective environmental literacy. With support from the Pisces Foundation, which has been a partner in looking at collective and community scale engagement in environmental issues, we've been exploring how individuals in a community come together to address sustainability challenges. We've been examining the research literature to gain a better understanding of collective constructs across many different fields and how we might better measure them. Based on this research, we've begun to develop measures of collective environmental literacy, including an interview protocol with plans to conduct community listening sessions and a network analysis this coming autumn. This summer, we conducted 3 community-based case studies working with climate justice organizations and community-based conservation organizations. One was based in Watsonville, California, another in the Shenandoah Valley, Virginia, and also with a number of organizations based right here in Palo Alto, at East Palo Alto, California. We started with these scoping interviews as a way to create a basis for the work that we're planning to do in the network analysis, surveys, and in more ethnographic studies over the coming year. But thus far, most of the interview data has been fascinating. It's demonstrated to us the importance of having shared and dedicated resources, including distributed knowledge throughout a community. Additionally, an emerging theme we're finding is a focus on emotions and feelings, which links to some of the earlier topics of today. People who are actively engaged in environmental action do believe that they can make a difference and that their communities can come together in a way to make a difference. These findings highlight the critical nature of self-efficacy and its complementary counterpart of collective efficacy. Interviewees talk about how overwhelming the issues are and how they can feel overwhelmed by challenges like climate change, sea level rise, and such. However, they also tap into the virtuous cycle of collective action, talking about how when people are engaged in challenging issues and working through them together, they're more likely to persist. That sense of accomplishment can support repeated engagement over time, returning to our earlier definition of hope. That even though the odds may be against a desired state, we still harbor a positive appraisal of the future and our ability to reach that desired state, especially when working toward a positive shared goal. I'd like to end today with an active reflection, a call to action, a call to get your hands in the dirt kind of mentality, which is critical for addressing these wicked problems like climate change, which require not only hope, but actionable skills, collaboration, and engagement. The ability to respect, understand, and work with others in various contexts and settings. It also requires the ability to pivot in light of changing conditions. Our greatest endeavor then is not simply to fill people with knowledge about how bad and challenging the situation is, but rather to equip them and ourselves with the tools, resources, and skills to make the change in a dynamic world. And finally, on a meta point, I thank you truly for joining me today in the moments of pause and practice that we've experienced. These have been intended to connect to the topic of the summit, but also I hope to demonstrate the way that we in our lab try to engage in our work. We often think of contemplative practices as internal and individual, and yet I hope what we've discussed here today and been able to experience in these short reflections is emphasize that reflecting on our internal well-being can prepare us and really lay the groundwork for helping take action broader and outside ourselves in our community and as part of a broader group. I then end by inviting us to consider together questions such as, what can I do now, today? What can we do now, today? What can I do tomorrow? And what can we do tomorrow? Remembering that even though these issues are enormous and overwhelming, that we're not in this alone and that there's already much that's been done and we can continue to build on that work. So thank you so much for your time today, your attention, whether you're actually sitting and staring at the computer or folding laundry or checking your email or preparing for the next presentation, whatever bit of your attention and time I had today, I'm so grateful. This is truly a lifetime of work, and it requires all of us in many different ways and all the different times and ways that we work on this. I am grateful to be on this journey with so many of you. And I look forward to conversation and to questions. And again, thank you for your grace as we muddle through this together. I also have one more slide. I want to give a special note of gratitude to my colleagues, Allison and Rochelle and Anna, who helped with the presentation today. Without them, there would be no presentation or talk, both in terms of the research that we do, as well as helping put this together. So thank you so much.
Thank you. I invite everyone to enter your questions in the Q&A function in the bottom right corner of your webinar screen. Our first question is whether you've done research on what you refer to as the mountaintop moments and how often those are tucked away as a fond memory, but how those mountaintop moments can be resourced and then applied into action.
So that's a great question about mountaintop experiences. My take, and we have done quite a bit of work on experiences that would count as mountaintop type experiences, or they can also be called peak experiences. The research that we have on that, and I'm happy to share that afterward, is that a lot of times something that may appear as a peak experience or a mountaintop experience is actually an accumulation of a lot of experiences throughout the course of one's life. And in fact, we hope is also a jumping off point for many other experiences in one's life. So it's rare that you would have a mountaintop experience that truly stands on its own. And in fact, from an ecological perspective, you could also say this about a mountain as well, right? A mountain top doesn't just sit alone out there. It's connected to the rest of the ecosystem. So the work that we do on mountaintop experiences, what we find is that there's an awful lot of cognitive and affective preparation that goes into someone at some point having an aha moment. So if you go on a nature-based tour that suddenly brings everything together for you, an eco tour, we do a lot of work in places like Galapagos or in national parks. And maybe at the time, everything kind of comes together for you in this really incredible spark. It may be because you've been reading on that, or it's a place you've been dreaming about for a long time, or you go with your closest friend and the two of you experience that together in great richness. And then you continue those connections for many years afterward. So that's something that's very interesting to us. And I'm happy to share research with you after this.
Thank you. Another question. This person writes that, could you please elaborate more on the theoretical frameworks behind the induced curiosity action from being at the place and how VR can play a part in that framework?
Ooh, that's a great question. I would break that up maybe into a couple of different questions. One is this idea of how do we encourage and support and induce curiosity from being in a place or having an experience. And then the other part of that may be kind of the technology side of things like virtual reality or AR, augmented reality, which we've done some work in that as well. So curiosity is one of those really wonderful and exciting topics, and it's often one that does have what we call this kind of virtuous cycle, that the more curious you are, the more curious you can learn to be. And it's one of those topics that we also explore quite a bit in our lab. For example, one of my PhD students, Anna Lee, is working currently in Big Basin, reviewing some GoPro footage that was taken just before, unfortunately, before some of the large fires out there. And she's specifically coding for constructs of awe. But within that, she certainly also hears a lot of kind of curiosity-based questions. things like, what do you think of, or what does that remind you of, or I notice, or I wonder, any of these kinds of notions that would go with ideas around curiosity. And so there are all kinds of educational and interpretive practices that we can incorporate. I would also say certainly contemplative practices that we can incorporate that help us notice the world around us in different ways and in ways that are more attentive. To then couple that with your question about VR and AR. I'll start maybe with the AR, because we have been working, and my doctoral student, Veronica Lin, was working with Big Basin on an augmented reality experience with regard to their new visitor center that would help people notice certain parts of the experience in different ways. So be able to notice different species or different parts of the trail. So there certainly are ways to take technology and have it augment and enrich the experience rather than only distracting from the experience. I think we've all experienced technology in different ways over the past year and a half. So again, happy to talk more about that.
Thank you. The next question is timely for the COP26, and it asks you to speak about what you know is happening to coordinate globally collective efficacy.
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. I appreciate that. I think I had a few quotes included in here, but not as many, thankfully, not as many as I could have. There are a lot of people who are talking about the need for collective action. There are a lot of people talking about the need for collective action at the community scale. So I hope all of us here today, this represents a fantastic community. There's also certainly a lot of people talking about the need for collective action and efficacy at the policy scale. So there is a lot of attention to this, both from nonprofit organizations and activists, a lot of youth, so many youth groups. The youth are incredibly far ahead on thinking about the need for collective action and collective behaviors around climate in particular. Something that I like to take the opportunity whenever I have a platform to mention this is that when we talk about collective action and collective behavior, to my mind, and certainly in the work that we've done, it doesn't mean that individual action is not important for a couple of reasons. One is that individual action, everything from our own preparation of ourselves in contemplative practice to taking individual actions in one's home or in one's own workplace, prepares us to be part of those larger scale actions. And it prepares us to be in harmony in our personal lives, in our professional lives, or in our community-facing lives. I also, as someone originally from Washington, D.C., always remembered that policymakers are people too. And policymakers are we hope, reflecting what we as maybe individuals and communities are asking them to do or engaging them in conversations. And so I think of it as a cycle where we all have different roles to play at different times. And I think that that's part of what can be really part of this process of engagement and feeling like we have an opportunity for efficacy.
Thank you. The next question is related to the construct of love, to follow on your focus on hope. The question says, did I understand you to say that collective action in a community is often preceded by individuals, lots of them, basically falling in love with nature and thus developing an internal drive to protect and nurture? I'm 75 years old and I'm in love with nature and hope everyone will come to feel this way.
I love your question. That brings tears to my eyes. That's a great question. I think I think it's a beautiful and very moving path to become engaged in these very challenging issues. I think that's also a regenerative path. My colleague Dilla Williams writes about regenerative hope. She may be with us today. I'm not sure if she's on this call, but if so, she has a beautiful article about gardening and regenerative hope and talks about love for the world around you. And that is an incredibly moving path. And I think many of us who work in the environmental space and the conservation space have come here through that path. It's interesting that there are many people who are, say, in the activist world who also come to this path through say, a justice angle. So it may be through a slightly different path than the one that we've just been describing, but can also be equally powerful. And not that those two are separate from each other. They can certainly be married together in really interesting and intertwined ways. I only pull out those two right now in the interest of time, but to say that there are many different paths that people take to become engaged in sustainability and climate action, which I find heartening, that there are many diverse pathways that people can take to become engaged in community action and action around sustainability. But I really appreciate your question. Thank you.
Following on the topic of the role that technology could play, are you aware of any technology platform that provides companionship for conversation in relation to climate solutions?
That's an interesting one. There are a lot of technological spaces, let's say, on whether they're online spaces or apps where people are talking about engaging with each other and becoming involved in more collective action type behaviors. I can't think of one off the top of my head specifically, and maybe somebody will chat us here. I know that my research lab and I are constantly trading podcasts. We are total podcast junkies, and that's often a great place because different podcasts will have communities that grow up around them and around the discussions that pop up. There also are a number of online book clubs and Zoom book clubs. I'm sure in places they have in-person discussions as well. So there's some places that come to mind, but if people would like to share a response to that in the chat, we'd be happy to share that back with the broader group.
Thank you. The next question is, have you considered creating experiences for politicians? It's wonderful to get individuals to connect with nature and to experience all, and perhaps more urgent to get our politicians to have those experiences.
I love that. Actually, there are those kinds of experiences. I've been involved with some of them in the Chesapeake Bay ecoregion, which is where I mentioned that's my home ecoregion. It's also where I did some of my dissertation work. My dissertation focused on sense of place and environmental behavior at a ecoregional scale. And within the Chesapeake Bay ecoregion, there have been a number, for example, of ecoregion tours that have taken policymakers from different parts of the Shenandoah Valley out to the edges, the furthest reaches of the Chesapeake Bay, which it's an enormous ecoregion. It has parts of multiple states, a dozen states. So that's one example of how these hands-on experiential tours have really tried to engage policymakers from a variety of backgrounds across the political spectrum in conversations. There also, I myself have been quite involved in the philanthropic world, so working with groups that bring together researchers, nonprofit organizations, philanthropies to talk about the importance of working together across sectors in addressing these issues at large scales. And in those conversations, many times there are local scale politicians, state level politicians who come to those conversations as well. So I appreciate that question. I think it's really important that we think creatively about who all is involved in these conversations.
Thank you. Yesterday's news from the G20 meeting and the beginning of the COP26 conversations raises the topic of the relationship between economic factors and climate factors. How do you address the intersection between economic issues and climate issues?
Yeah, of course, I think like all of us, maybe many of us, I've been following, I've been waiting for this summit for a long time, and then I've been following it closely and listening with great anticipation. These are thorny issues. I think I would at times point back to the UN Sustainable Development Goals and the comments I made there about how intertwined these challenges are, and how if we address one part of that kind of pyramid, that it's really important to think about all of these together. As I mentioned to Tia briefly before we started, I had the great honor and pleasure of having a conversation a few weeks ago with Mr. Ban Ki-moon, who's the former head of the United Nations. And what really struck me in what number of things struck me in my conversation with him, that one of which was that I asked him about in his recent autobiography, which is excellent and so moving, that he talks about the intertwined nature of these complicated issues. And he says in his book that, at least in his experience, what he believes to be at the core of so many of them is the necessity of education. And I say that not only as someone who works in the School of Education, and also as the daughter of public school teachers, but in his personal experience and in his experience in the UN, he finds that education really is at the core of this tangled knot in so many ways. And so while economics are certainly also critical, I think if we look at the power of education to transform, I found that to be a really compelling message from him. And I was really glad to hear him say that as well.
If you would build on that point, there's been a question about education and the comment that education has often focused on equipping countries with a labor pool, and whether the construct of a civilian conservation corps as part of the nation's labor would inform educational policy and curriculum goals.
That's a really excellent question. And I think it's a really interesting way to think about providing youth with an opportunity to engage in their communities in very different ways, and in ways that they may not otherwise think as having opportunities for professional pathways. I know that as a faculty member here, I spend a lot of time talking to students, both undergrad and graduate, about what their next steps are. And many of them feel constrained by what they see as their choices for their next career steps. And I think having something like that would make a huge difference. I think they would see it as a much more viable set of career options if it was something that was supported more broadly. So I love that question.
And the question, another that's in the same arena, says, have you done research on engaging youth in place-based climate action solutions? And how did you engage the participants, and what did you find?
I have to say, some of these questions, I start to think, are these coming from my own research group? But I don't think they are, actually. Yes, in a couple of ways. One thing that we're doing right now that that was in the presentation initially that we cut, that's been so fun, is we've been doing interviews for about the last year and a half with youth climate activists, and talking with them about so many of the issues that I just shared with you today. So talking with them about what motivates them to get engaged in these issues, what they find challenging, what they think about that idea of the razor's edge of hope and optimism versus fear and pessimism. And were they more motivated by their concerns for their future, or were they more motivated by envisioning a positive, hopeful future? What do they see as the greatest challenges to their work? Who do they see kind of coming along with them versus who do they see as hesitant and burying their head in the sand? So that has been fascinating. We not only have been conducting them in our lab group, but also trying really hard to have youth interview youth. So while I may think that I know what's going on with the kids these days, I recognize that we have some high school interns who've been working with us for years and who are now just starting college. One of them has been doing some of the interviews, and we have other college students who are doing some of the interviews. So that's been one really great project that's been very informative. We also have worked with a number of, especially residential environmental education programs that specialize in place-based education, and working with them on not only climate change education, but on education for sustainability more broadly, and looking at how place-based education can be motivating when you're in a national park setting, but then how you also can take the lessons learned there and the experiences back to one's own home community, which is really important to recognize that while you may have an experience that's transformative in a national park, it's also important to build the skills and actions that you can then take back to your own home community. So again, happy to share with you some of those findings and papers afterward if you're interested.
In the spirit of sharing your findings, there's a question that ties back to Professor Gretchen Daly's comment about making science accessible and translated for the general community to benefit from the findings. To what extent is your lab resourced to provide that accessible version of your findings to a school teacher or a mayor or a family that wants to know what you're learning or discovering?
So we do a lot of that kind of work. Maybe those are two different questions. I would say that we do that kind of work extensively. How well are we resourced for it? That maybe a separate question. Because, well, I'll maybe explain a little bit as to why, but that is incredibly important to us. I would say in many ways that's at the core of what we do. And that may have come across a bit today, which is that we are while we are theoretically grounded, and my students probably get tired of me saying that, we also work very, very hard for almost every paper that we publish, we have a practitioner guide or some kind of outward facing practitioner, policymaker, piece for philanthropists. So we try to have something that is more accessible, since not everybody is like me, who wants to sit around reading journal articles on weekends. But we do a lot of work with creating research bulletins. We just are finishing up an online course that we developed with support from the US EPA and the North American Association for Environmental Education on how to use research in various practice settings. So we do a ton of that kind of work, and I find it really energizing and fun. So it's very important. The second part of that is that it takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of to do that kind of, I'm hesitant to call it even translation because that makes it sound one way, but to do that kind of knowledge co-production, it takes special expertise. And I would say that people in my group, many of them are just so talented at that. I'm so grateful for them. So yeah, we're happy to share the pieces we've done thus far. And I'm really glad somebody asked that question. It's so important.
And if you'd kindly restate your website so people know where to find this information.
Sure, we are the Social Ecology Lab here at Stanford. We can find that and share it out.
We have another question. As I have contemplated the challenges of climate change, I am struck by the contrasts of what needs to be preserved, which some of the summit speakers have emphasized, and what must be changed, which other speakers have emphasized. Considering the preservation of natural processes and the transformation of human behaviors, how do you address these two realms in your lab?
Ooh, that is such a good and thoughtful question. I would say that we, in some ways, work on both parts of that. As mentioned, we do work a lot with collaborative partners. And so in that case, depending on who the partner may be, what their focus of that partnership work, that may drive the area where we're emphasizing, whether it may be more, say, on the conservation preservation side, or whether it may be on the intervention, let's say, behavior change side. I hesitate a bit around that behavior change framing, partially because I think a lot of people are doing really amazing work in the world, and I don't always think that we need to change what people are doing. I think a lot of times it's encouraging work with your community. It's encouraging us to feel positively about what we're contributing to the world. And so I don't always only want to emphasize the behavior change piece. But one example of this is the work that we do in a place like Galapagos, which is a very special place to me. I've worked there since the early 2000s. And it is one of those places that certainly has parts of it that are 98% of the islands or the archipelago is a protected area. And so certainly has parts that are more on the preservation and conservation side. And then also has an incredibly thriving, brilliant, passionate, hardworking human population of 30,000 people, and then has many visitors who go and who also care deeply about the islands. And so that's a really interesting example of an ecosystem where we do work that kind of walks that balance that you just asked about.
Building on that helpful response, an individual references the fact that there are websites now such as Project Drawdown and Regeneration that offer ranked options of actions so that you may have a feeling, if you have, as we all do, a limited sense of time and energy, what impact will be rendered by what action. And the question is, are the algorithms that determined the ranking, including both of those factors of preservation and human behavior change? I know you just used a better term than behavior change.
It's a complicated space. It's such a good question, so tricky. I know I keep saying that these are great questions because they are. Y'all are asking lots of great questions. That is a question, maybe not in that exact format, but that general idea is one that comes up a lot when we talk about this space. I mean, I'll say that I taught my first in-person class in a year and a half in late August, and this is a topic we discussed for probably at least half an hour at the end. People stayed after class to discuss this. Partially because it is such a complicated space. There are so many different considerations to take into account when trying to figure out what are kind of the most impactful behaviors for whom, under what conditions, especially because we are taking action in a dynamic system. So these systems are constantly changing. One, I will say, I'm a huge fan of Project Drawdown. I think they do excellent work, top-notch work, high quality science, and are very thoughtful about the kinds of actions that they're trying to recommend for people. I did mention earlier that I worked at WWF for a number of years, and I still do collaborate with them on a number of projects. And one of the interesting things that used to happen there is we would try to be very thoughtful, maybe in a similar way to Drawdown, about recommending behaviors, and we would constantly get pushback from very thoughtful constituents saying, just tell me what to do, right? The world is so complicated, just tell me what to do. And I think that this again is kind of the balance that we try to walk, those of us who work in, say, the education space or who work in this behavior space, right? Which is that in our ideal world, the gold standard is we want everyone to contemplate and to listen and to discuss and to think about this over and over just as much as we do or as we try to, and yet recognizing that people's lives are incredibly full. People are doing many different things at once. And so we do have to have these heuristics that simplify, and we have to then decide, and we have to rank within these heuristics what's most important when, under what conditions. So that's, I realize, a long, complicated, annoyingly academic answer, but I hope it's helpful in some way.
Thank you, very helpful. Another individual asks about the research and whether there's been research that focuses on compassion, and that there was earlier talks about compassion, awe, and gratitude as a rubric. However, are there specific studies that have looked at compassion and action to take care of the planet?
Yes, there are. And today I specifically focused on hope. We have in some of our studies, in fact, actually in the Redwood study a bit, I mentioned Anna's work on awe, which has been so fun and interesting, just trying to come up with a rubric about how do you measure awe in that context, and how do you know awe when you see it or when you hear somebody else expressing it. So similarly with compassion, there are a number of studies that look at compassion, and certainly it's kind of among this suite of affective elements that we have been considering as well. It certainly is part of this idea that when there's compassion toward the human species and then compassion toward other species and in our ecosystem in which we're interacting. So I'm, again, happy to share some of that with you afterwards as well. I've got a long list of resources that we'll be sharing. So again, great question.
Thank you. Do you have information about whether the Tree Mail project is replicated in other parks?
So there are similar projects to that, and actually we have some hope postcards we can share, and actually Allison might be able to share that site here with us. We have been working on something similar because when we were initially worked with them, we were building on postcards that they had. So we've been working on similar postcards. If any of you are interested in sharing hope postcards, connection and awe postcards, we'd be happy to share that with you. I will say too, this summer I was in Grand Tetons and hiked out to a relatively remote spot and was delighted to find a little post box there. I love real mail. And in this little post box, there were some postcards in there and a journal that people had been taking notes about their experience. So I do know that other national parks have something similar. I don't know that they have done a systematic analysis in the same way that we have. But if other people know of a similar systematic analysis and or places where we could partner, we'd be happy to hear about it. Please enter it in the chat.
Thank you. We have another individual asking you to speak to the human inclination towards greed, and greed that can develop resources to the detriment of the planet and to the collective well-being.
This is a difficult one, and certainly one about which I think quite a bit. And I think this does also intersect with some of the themes that we've been hearing this week throughout this wonderful symposium, which is that when we are, at least in the experiences that we've seen in our research, I think when you're coming together in community and working with others, there is more of a sense of this pro-social behavior. And some of these more negative behaviors can be moderated in some ways. Yet I do think that this is part of the human condition. Part of the human condition is always this need for more, this want for more. And that this is a continual tension and continual challenge. So I appreciate that question. And I certainly don't mean for it to come across that everything that we find is again, getting back to that term Pollyanna-ish, right? That's certainly not the intention here. And I think we are always fighting, even within ourselves, always fighting for that peace and that space to be able to step back and contemplate on what is actually needed, when and why. And we rely on our community to help us remember that balance.
And I'll just point us back to the two questions you offered at the close of your prepared talk. I believe they were, what can I do today? And what can we do today? And what can I do today? And what can we do tomorrow? And for those who are asking questions about greed, to perhaps answer those questions in terms of what you know makes a difference around greed. Our next question is that you just focused on the collective experience and how connection with each other has a fulfillment and a motivation benefit. And several people have referenced the fact that many children are still not in school, and even if they're in school, they're having less opportunities to feel connected with each other due to the pandemic guidelines for health and well-being. How do you feel at this current time in history in relation to the pandemic, families and youth can be supported in discovering the merit and benefit and value of collective environmental action?
So we've been doing some research in that space as well. And I'll also note that I appreciate that question so much. We're not the only ones who are doing research in this. I think because it is such a troubling time for families and communities across the world. The work that we've been doing in this space, I'll recognize my PhD student, Veronica Lynn, who's been doing some online diary studies, actually looking at how families are using their time at home and how and in what ways they may be connected with nature-rich environments. this goes back to an earlier question somebody else had about AR and VR and technology-based resources. Recognizing that I myself live in a condo with a back deck, but I don't have a backyard, and so I try to bring up that point as often as I can, especially with families who may feel that they don't have space to go outside all the time or to be in a large park, or may feel constrained by their location. So what we've been finding in that study, though, is how heartening it is that parents are really desiring to engage with young people and with their children in all kinds of ways, whether it's watching a YouTube video and then discussing the ways that they agree or don't agree with some of the science that's presented in it, and really having rich conversations with their young people, whether it's going for a simple walk around the block, whether it's talking about a simple science experiment that they can do in the house. So that's been a really interesting study to see how creative these parents are. And these are families all across the country that have been engaging in that study. There are also a number of other studies that are looking at access to pocket parks in smaller places that are closer to home. So I think, I really appreciate the comment that we keep talking about that we're in the post-COVID recovery time, and recognizing that actually there's still so many challenges that are happening, and that we are all still in this kind of collective state of really a transformed world and a transformed life. And that, again, community, I think, is more important than ever. And that's something I hope that we retain from this, is recognize the importance of community and support for each other, and that we don't have to go only to the Galapagos or the Yosemite or Yellowstone to have a little experience of nature. We can do that closer to home.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tia. It has been such a pleasure to be here today. I wish I could see all these wonderful people, that we could all be in person together. But in the future, I look forward to meeting so many of you, and wish you all the very best.